A guard wrenched prisoner 27 from his bunk and shoved him across the wooden platform before he could say a word. Fear hit prisoner 27 first. A quick, hot brace in his throat that made him mouth the blanket and grip the slat with both hands. He fought the motion with his knees, then let his body follow the guard's shove, because resistance only invited a sharper twist of the wrist. That first shove names the chapter's problem: sleep must be denied, and that problem will shape every choice he makes in the hours to come. The corridor smelled of boiled linen and old smoke. Prisoner 27 had been assigned the number late the previous week. He kept the number to remind himself where he fit. He had not yet learned the rotation's logic. He learned by muscle and pain. A guard's elbow hooked behind his shoulder, a wooden platform slamming to a new grate, boots clattering like a clock. He blinked candlelight into two columns of faces and saw the warden watching a pocket watch rimmed in dim brass. A thin-lipped voice called, 27, move. The senior guard shoved him again. Prisoner 27 swallowed and forced his feet to carry him upright. Fear, then a hard suspicion, tightened his jaw. The suspicion that the moves were not arbitrary, that something else was being measured. That suspicion made him look for patterns in the guard's hands, for rhythms in the pocket watch the warden did not hide. They had arrived as numbers on a ledger 2 days earlier. At dawn, the record keeper had lifted each man by name, transport manifests, baseline vitals, a short tick of measurements, and prisoner 27 remembered the ledgers rose like teeth. The camp's rules were never explained. Veterans mouthed the rules in half phrases to new men. You wake when they turn you, you don't fall when they watch. Those fragments built the reality. Bodies moved to deny rest. The warden stood on the landing above the rotating platforms with his coat buttoned to the throat. He tapped a rhythm with gloved fingers on the banister and consulted the brass watch. He had a lean face, angular and pale, a thin scar at his temple. He looked like someone who measured outcomes the way a gardener measures rows. Neat, relentless. Prisoner 27 watched him and felt the suspicion become a plan. If the schedule governed bodies, then mapping the schedule might buy a moment of shelter. They moved him into the next slot. The platform clacked. A thin lamp guttered. A veteran inmate, who had been awake long enough to carry a steady, resigned pace, leaned close in the dim and whispered, "Stay stiff. Don't let them read your sleep." The veteran's words were not comfort. They were instruction. Prisoner 27 kept his muscles tight like cords. After the turnover, the record keeper filed the new entries in a room ringed with lamps. He wrote with a steady hand. The record keeper's name, Marek, appeared often where the ledger was open. Marek checked pupils, pressed fingers to wrists, wrote numbers. Two newly arrived men leaned on each other and asked, "Why the turning?" Marek did not answer at first. He filled in columns. When he did speak, he said, "They keep you moving so nothing settles. They say rest lets you break. We are records. We catalog what breaks." Marek's voice was low, prosec. His speech did not plead. That matter of factness hardened prisoner 27's fear into another motion detection. He began to watch which platforms slotted when, which guards carried the keyring, which bunk came empty first. At midday, the warden met with the senior guard and the camp surgeon in a small office that overlooked the rotation chamber. The warden pointed at a chalked schedule and spoke in steady sentences. "Tighter," he said, "reduce the interval by 2 minutes. Record the collapse times. Warden, the men. The surgeon began, you record. The warden, you note neuro irregularities. You do not stop the test." The surgeon, a thick-handed man named Dra. Havel pressed his thumb into the shelf of his coat and said, "If they faint, we lose data. If they sleep, we lose control," the warden answered. The exchange was brief. The warden's language was clinical. He treated collapse and endurance like measurements on a page. Prisoner 27 listened from the corridor when a guard's door cracked and he caught the last of the conversation. Suspicion shifted into doubt. If the warden called this a test, then the camp's cruelty had purpose beyond punishment. Doubt made prisoner 27 search for the surgeon where the white cloth met blood. In the infirmary that afternoon, Havel bent above a collapsed man while the senior guard stood with arms folded. The man's eyelids fluttered and then still. Havel checked reflexes, iced the temples, and noted a shallow, rapid breathing pattern. He allowed, not to the patient but to the room, unusual, eyes don't track. Motor tremors, he put a finger to his lip and then wrote on a scrap and filed it into a pocket marked internal. The camp surgeon did his clinical work and then looked away. His hands were efficient when they cut bandage. His eyes briefly met Marek's across the corridor when Marek adjusted a ledger entry. Marek's fingers hesitated over the ink and then blotted the line. The hesitation made prisoner 27's doubt leap into fear again, this time laced with a sharper worry that record and body were being separated by people with different aims. Prisoner 27 tried a quiet resistance that evening. On a rotating platform lit by a single dangling lamp, he stiffened his shoulders in a way the veteran had taught him. He kept his eyelids forced open with pins of resolve. The senior guard came near and whacked his knuckles with the butt of a flashlight. Name, the guard said. 27. He managed, move then, the senior guard. And he applied pressure to the platform's axle with a wrench as if testing its resistance. Prisoner 27's small act of falsified wakefulness bought him a less severe slot for one round. He felt a slender triumph, and then the camp's machinery swallowed any sense of victory. That small success turned into a new emotion, defiant calculation. He began timing the watch clicks, counting platform revolutions in the dark so he could predict which slot would come next. Marek, the record keeper, discovered more than he expected that night. The ledger showed an uptick. 3 collapses in one evening where there had been none the week before. Marek's pen stopped on a line. He carried the ledger to the warden's office with the weight of ink in his hands. Look, Marek, handing over the pages, 3 collapses in one night. Look at these times. The warden lifted a row with deliberate fingers and did not flinch. Record it as expected. Accidents. Mechanical failure. He set the brass watch on the desk and closed his hand above it. Marek's voice tightened. These are clustered. The interval was altered mid-rotation. The warden's expression did not change, then tighten the schedule further. If the system fails, find the failure in its limits. A confrontation flickered but did not burn. Marek's resistance was the first public challenge to the system's objectivity. He left with the ledger lighter on its pages, and prisoner 27 watched him go and felt the suspicion turn into a sharper fear. Fear that the ledger would be silenced. Night deepened. Men lay strapped into wooden slots that moved like teeth in a cog. The rotation room smelled of sweat and old oil. Prisoner 27's limbs were bruised from constant shifts. He counted the minutes differently now, not with calendar days but with the sound of the warden's watch. The chamber had a mechanical heart, a central circular platform with spokes of bunks that turned in timed measures. At the edge of the turning disc, a maintenance man, an older inmate who had worked in the mill, checked bolts under the watch of the senior guard. Prisoner 27 heard metal scrape, then the sound that would change the night, a grinding, a sudden keening pitch where wood met axle. The rotating platform hiccuped and stopped with a low groan. The lights guttered to a harsher candle and men shifted like thrown logs. For a second everyone froze, then panic moved faster than orders. Bodies jammed as the platform sat half-turned. Prisoner 27 felt a bunk's edge lever at his ribs and smelled the sharp wetness of someone else bleeding. A man behind him tried to squeeze forward and his hand caught in a chain. A second later a muffled yell turned into a wet silence. The senior guard barked orders and struck with his club. Men pushed to free themselves. The platform had trapped multiple bodies in a wedge. The warden appeared above the ring like a cold instrument. He did not kneel to pull men free. He looked at his watch, then at the trapped bodies, then at the senior guard. Restart it. The warden, get them moved. We record the endpoints. They were crushed. The senior guard, we need to unbolt, then pull. Restart. Now, the warden's voice cut the room. His order did not ask a question. The senior guard hesitated, then swung his club. 2 guards shoved themselves into the gap and hauled. There was a scream that tore into the control of the room, and then multiple screams layered on top of it. Prisoner 27 heard the crack of splintering wood and the dry, sharp sound of bone. He saw a face go white, then wet, as a man was forced across a seam. "Dura!" Havel pushed through the press, hands out, and began triage with the same clinical calm he used in the infirmary. "Do it cleanly. Dura." Havel to a young guard, and while his hands worked he said into his collar, "Document cranial trauma." Pupils dilated. Spinal alignment possible. Marek, the warden when the record keeper reached the door. Note time of restart and list injuries as operational incidents. Marek's pen shook. he wrote, then paused. He met Dr. Havel's eye. The surgeon looked away and returned to his cuts. Marek's hesitation was a small, visible rebellion. He scribed, blotted, and folded the ledger closed. He left the book in the warden's drawer. The jam hurt more than bodies. It cracked the idea of measured objectivity. Prisoner 27 had watched the warden's order and felt an emotion shift. His earlier defiant calculation became raw urgency. He moved toward a man pinned under timber and sought to push a splintered board away. A guard shoved him back. Hands off. The senior guard snapped. You will be on the next shift. Prisoner 27's shoulder hit the iron rail. He had to choose. Keep to the system's anonymity or try to pry a man free and draw violence. He reached in any way. His fingers found a boot that slid free, then a wrist, then a damp collar. He yanked. A fellow prisoner groaned and then coughed out a short, ragged breath. The act of pulling someone back from a seam felt like stealing time. In the scramble, a detail emerged that changed the way Marek and a few others understood the whole experiment. A maintenance bolt on the platform had been loosened manually. It had not come loose from where. Marek found a mark on the bolt, a file scrape consistent with a tool, not fatigue. That scrape became the twist. It implied intent behind the jam. Someone did this on purpose. Marek allowed. It wasn't chance. Who would sabotage us? The senior guard barked. Enough talk. Secure the wounded. The idea that the jam might be deliberate moved suspicion into a new, harder emotion. Anger edged with a confusion that spread outward. Whom did they serve? Who wanted bodies tested up to their breaking point? The warden's calm answer came slow. We do what is necessary, he said. If a bolt is loosened, make a note. Find the hand. If a man is crushed, note endpoints. We have to know the limit. Marek stared at him and then at the ledger. The ledger had started as a list of names. It was becoming proof that the camp engineered extremes to observe collapse. The warden's instruction to note endpoints reframed every previous rotation as trial, every forced wakefulness as controlled variable. The collapse changed alliances. The camp surgeon had to treat wounds under strict instruction. He stitched while the senior guard argued with a young recruit about whether to call for outside repair tools. The recruit said, "We can't stop. Orders are orders." The senior guard snapped back. Orders to restart come from the landing, in the pre-dawn aftermath. The infirmary smelled of boiled cloth and disinfectant. Jude Havel marked 2 deaths with a blunt pen and wrote causes, mechanical crush. Marek altered ledger lines that recorded time of death to fit the warden's order. When he left the infirmary, he paused in the corridor and watched the warden walk away like a man closing a book. Prisoner 27 sat on a splintered bench and flexed fingers that ached from prying. The man he had pulled from the seam held his side and breathed against the pain. Prisoner 27 said simply, "Are you breathing?" "Jakov." The man managed. "Name's Jakov. You saved me. I'm 27, he replied. They did not have a conversation that loosened the camp's control, but the act had consequences. The senior men watched Prisoner 27, and the warden logged the night's events into his own small notebook bound in oilcloth. He circled figures in the margins. He made a new line on the schedule. When dawn stole into the corridors, the rotation resumed. The warden adjusted the interval by another minute. Marek came to Prisoner 27 and Jakov with a ledger under his arm. "You saw the bolt, Marek." Prisoner 27 nodded. Marek closed his eyes for a breath and then opened them with a decision visible across his face. He softly, "I will put a note here, but I will not write who did it. We cannot be the ones to point fingers." Prisoner 27 felt a final shift in himself. Fear became resolve. He would not be reckless, but he would not hide evidence if hiding meant more men crushed. He understood that small acts of defiance could be measured like any other variable, made visible only when recorded. Later that morning, the warden walked the ring and tapped the warden's iron signet ring against the banister. He spoke to no one, and yet every man heard the cadence of a ledger closing. He into the dim, keep proper records. We will not let sentiment cloud the results. The chapter's conflict, the jam, the crush, the question of intent, had been answered insofar as the camp continued to run. The warden ordered restart, men were treated, and ledger lines were adjusted. Marek had tried to preserve truth with a marginal note. Dr. Havel had recorded medical signs and then set them into the warden's drawer when ordered. Prisoner 27 had chosen to act and had pulled Jakov from the seam. The wound in the rotation's logic remained, and the warden's next schedule tightened the intervals further. The final image of the chapter is concrete and immediate. Merrick placed a folded scrap in the ledger, a single line written in small, cramped script. Bolt shows file marks. Investigate source. He slid the book under the warden's desk and closed the drawer. The warden's hand rested on top of it for a moment, then the watch clicked. He replaced the ledger in the drawer, locked it with the plain iron keyring, and walked down the corridor to check the platforms himself. Prisoner 27 watched the warden walk away and felt the weight of that locked drawer as though it were an extra chain. He turned back to Jakov and said, "Rest when you can. Count the steps between turns." Jakov nodded and exhaled a breath that trembled. Outside the rotation chamber, the maintenance man began replacing the loosened bolt under the senior guard's supervision. The camp's machinery hummed back into motion. The ledger remained in the desk. The chapter ends on that concrete beat. The warden's hand closing the drawer over Merrick's note, and the renewed schedule already being chalked above the rotation room. Minutes shaved away. A prisoner folded on the wooden landing and guards ignored the fall. He hit the boards with a small thud, limbs slack, breath rasping. Suspicion drove the warden to move through that chamber. He had learned to treat every collapse as data. The warden stepped to the gallery railing and listened without surprise. The central problem sat plain. Rotation was failing to produce clean results, and every failure threatened the purpose he had assigned to the camp. The late-night corridor smelled of sweat and spilled candle tallow. Men lay pressed against the inner rail, faces turned away from the circle of light. The warden watched the limping mass and tapped his brass watch twice with a gloved finger. He did not look shocked. He catalogued. He had the look of a man who counted breaths the way other men counted prayers. Prisoner 53 had been shoved into motion when prisoner 27 had been ripped from his bunk in the last watch. That earlier wrenching, when a guard yanked prisoner 27 and shoved him across the platform, remained in the ledger. The ledger listed time, loss of posture, and a note. Strain observed. The warden referenced that entry now and ordered the head guard to make a note of the collapse on the landing. He wanted the pattern explicit. The warden descended the observation steps, while the field surgeon moved through the ring below with a lamp. The surgeon's lamp pulled the flesh into flat detail. Pale lips, bluied fingertips, a wetness at an eye. The surgeon crouched and felt a pulse. He spoke in a low, clipped voice. Field surgeon, the warden, condition, concussive collapse. The field surgeon replied, respiration shallow. Shock response, record oxygen, blood pressure, notes on wake response. The warden, yes, warden, the field surgeon answered. He rolled the limp wrist and made a small mark on a paper card with a stub of pencil. The warden showed no pity. He showed a procedure. Suspicion shifted into calculation. He needed a precise sequence of events, lapse, record, acceleration. His hands caught the brass chain as if it were part of the apparatus and not jewelry. A head guard knelt beside prisoner 53 and checked the binding of the platform. He breathed through his nose and said, "Tighten tempo on the next cycle. Keep them moving 4 minutes longer." The warden listened and then nodded. 4 minutes. Measure fatigue at each hour mark. Chronicle collapse times. The head guard lifted prisoner 53 by an elbow and eased him toward the infirmary alcove. Another guard shoved the next man forward before the limp prisoner could even find the floor. The rotation resumed. The wooden planks creaked in a regular, heard rhythm. The warden's watch clicked open and closed like a metronome. The records room smelled of damp paper and oil. The camp clerk and the field surgeon sat over logs at dawn. They compared entries in the book with the sleep logs and injury sheets. The clerk turned pages with a finger gone white around the nail. These do not match the summary sent to Central. The collapse counts are higher, and the durations adjust in one direction only. The field surgeon tapped the page. They escalate. Each cycle shorter rest, longer rotation. Intentional, the clerk's lips moved. He wrote a line and then crossed it out. Who authorized the change? He asked. The warden. He issued schedule updates last month. The field surgeon answered. They both stared at the ink. This was not chaos. It was a protocol being tightened. Suspicion sharpened into alarm in the clerk's breath. He had not expected needlepoint method. At midday, the warden arranged a demonstration. He chose a cluster of men and ordered the head guard to place them on the center platform. The gallery filled with officers. small and severe. The warden wore his stiff utilitarian coat. His iron signet ring caught the candlelight. He stood with his hands folded around the brass watch and inspected the men like specimens. "Start the watch," he said. The head guard set the tempo. He called, "Begin." The platform pushed the men in a slow arc. The warden measured with the chain and marked the time on a pad. He ordered an increase in tempo. The guards moved the platform faster, each shove neat and repeated. A prisoner reached for the rail and failed to catch himself. The warden wrote, eyes narrowed. During the demonstration, the junior guard stood to the side, face slack, jaw working. He had been on the floor the night prisoner 27 was wrenched out. He remembered the man trying to speak as he was pushed. He remembered the way the wooden slat had dug into a palm. He heard the field surgeon refer to shock response and felt a hesitation in his chest that translated into movement. He slipped a scrap of folded paper to prisoner 53 when the rotation slowed around the far side. No one saw the junior guard's fingers brush the prisoner's ribs. The scrap was small, penciled coordinates, a crude phrase, a breath to a human. It read only, "Hold watch." When prisoner 53 unfolded the scrap later, he did not see poetry. He saw instruction. He saw a chance. He held the scrap under his palm and let the rotation yank him forward until his shoe caught the lip of the platform. He pushed a metal cog, then stole the warden's watch as it hung from the chain during a close pass. The warden noticed the missing weight. His eyes cut to the head guard watch. The warden, "It was on the chain." The head guard replied, "It was." Prisoner 53 seized the watch between bodies. Guards shoved. Men collided. The center of the platform became a knot of limbs. The warden moved down from the gallery in 3 long strides. He did not shout. He moved with a measured speed that matched his previous calculations. His gloves closed on the watch, and then they did not. The watch left his hand. A shout split the circle. The head guard barked rapid orders. "Hold them." "Hold them?" "Get it back." Prisoner 53 spun with the watch clutched to his chest. "Head guard, give me a breath, please," he gasped. "Just a breath." The head guard slapped his shoulder. Prisoner 53, "Drop it now." 3 guards tackled the prisoner. The warden stepped into the pile and pressed his hand to the watch as if pressing a wound. The field surgeon wrenched a shoulder and called for antiseptic. The platform kept moving a notch. The system's momentum resisted human interruption. A fight burst. A guard's heel found a rib. A prisoner's elbow landed across a temple. The warden did not cry out. He lifted his chin and ordered, "Calm, record the time," he said. "Record interruptions and recovery intervals." The head guard, breathing hard, shouted back. "We lost the watch for 12 seconds. He interfered with the timing. Discipline is broken, then restore discipline." The warden, "Measure the effect. Note which men fail to hold position. Remove privileges accordingly." The field surgeon snatched the watch from the warden's palm and handed it to the clerk. "Make entry. Watch interference recorded, 12 seconds. List injuries sustained during scramble." The clerk wrote, "Watch interference, physical confrontation, 6 wounded. 3 require sutures." Rhythm resumed. He did not write who had taken the watch. He paused and added, "A temperament notes filed." He underlined the phrase and closed the book. Outside the ring, a junior guard turned his back and swallowed. He had given the scrap. He had meant to hand a note of human pity. He had not meant to start the fight. He moved his shoulders as if to dislodge the memory of a man's thumb finding the metal chain. His hesitation had become action. In the infirmary corridor, the field surgeon worked with clean hands and a blunt light. He stitched a cheek and set a fractured finger. His tone did not rise. He wrote, "Sutures required, hemorrhage controlled, expect prolonged fatigue. How many will be fit for duty tomorrow?" The head guard, "Most." The field surgeon, "Some will fail the next cycle." That exchange shifted the ledger. The warden watched the operation from the doorway. His jaw tightened. The suspicion that had started his attention turned next into a slow, contained fury. He had built a system to measure endurance. He had not planned for human sympathy to corrupt its numbers. He called the head guard into his office. The office was small and severe, a desk, a lamp, a single cot. The warden's coat hung neat and the oilcloth notebook lay open. He tapped the notebook with a gloved finger and said, "Discipline is slipping. We need stricter enforcement." The head guard's voice was flat. "We had interference." A prisoner took the watch. A junior guard slipped a scrap. Find the junior guard, the warden ordered. Report his name and post. Double the rounds on the east corridor. Add physical correction for any guard who shows hesitation. Head guard hesitated and then said, "Yes, warden." That scene tightened stakes. The warden's fury was now administrative. He converted anger into orders that would produce measurable results. The anguish of the men below would become a variable. The head guard left to execute the orders. Meanwhile, the clerk and the field surgeon compared the results once more. The clerk: "This will look different to central if you change the summary. The numbers will show increased endurance under stress. It will disguise the lengthened cycles." The field surgeon lifted his chin. "Our job is to report facts. But the warden demands certain outcomes, then either report facts or resign." The clerk: They argued in quiet sentences. Their debate required 3 quick exchanges, each staccato and short. "You cannot falsify the records." The clerk: "He will put them in different columns." The field surgeon replied: "And you will sign." The clerk: "I will sign the entries that describe the men as they are found." The field surgeon: "But I will not falsify injury causes." Their words were small ruptures that unspooled into procedure. The clerk's hand hovered over the ledger, and then wrote. Adjusted schedule per warden's direction. The chapter reached a mid-point cliffhanger when the injured men began whispering about the scrap. Prisoner 53 lay with a bandaged thumb and a stolen watch beneath his pillow in the infirmary. He had learned in the scramble that stealing the watch did not stop the turn. It only changed who kept the time. He had also learned that the junior guard's scrap had a name scribbled on the back. A guard found the scrap when he swept the infirmary mattress. He read the name and handed it up the chain. For the warden, this was proof of contagion. For the head guard, this was proof of breach. For the junior guard, it was a single moment when the world he moved through narrowed into consequence. At night, the warden recorded the confrontation in his oilcloth notebook with precise strokes. He wrote the number of interruptions, the length, the injuries. He wrote the names of the guards on duty and circled the junior guard's line twice. He added, "Enforced tempo." Harsher measures authorized. The next midday, the warden staged another demonstration, this time with the platform rotating longer. He watched the men edge into exhaustion while the head guard increased the tempo in increments. He measured breath counts and step counts. He made the field surgeon call out times of collapse. He had converted suspicion into a protocol that eroded the body's limits. The junior guard was pulled aside and questioned beneath the gallery. "I only name the warden." He gave it. It in a small voice that tried to be a fact. Samuel Cloth. "Why did you do it?" The warden. Samuel's hands twisted. "Because I saw them fall. Because I could not do nothing. You interfered with the apparatus." The head guard. "That is betrayal of duty." Samuel swallowed and then said, "I gave a scrap." He took it. "I didn't think." 3 guards moved in and took Samuel by the arms. The warden watched them carry him across the platform. They shoved him back into the rotation for a full cycle as a public lesson. He did not issue a formal sentence on paper. He enacted one in front of witnesses. The warden's closed expression softened into a clinical gaze. By the end of the demonstration, one man could not stand. The warden recorded the failure and then closed his notebook. He ordered the head guard to increase watch patrols at dusk. No more scraps. Any guard complicit will be removed. The camp clerk folded his hands over the ledger and stared at the day's additions. The field surgeon left the room with a lamp and a tray of instruments. He stopped at the infirmary to watch the men sleep in short bursts. He catalogued the shallow breaths and the way fingers twitched in sleep. Prisoner 53, awake in an hour of weak light, slid the watch under his mattress. He felt a tremor run through him that was not just from fatigue. He had touched the warden's property and felt the warden's control. He had seen the warden's reaction. A set jaw, clipped orders, a ledger thickening. The warden returned to the gallery and, without looking at any single man, said, "Record resumed. Continue rotations. Increased tempo at first light." The head guard repeated the order. "Increased tempo at first light," he said. He turned and barked to the men below. The rotation would accelerate again. When dawn came, the platform moved faster. Men stumbled. A cluster of boots struck wood in staccato. The warden watched the ledger for anomalies. The ledger had become his instrument. The watch had been returned to his hand. The watch had cost a dozen breaths, a handful of stitches, and a promise of tighter discipline. The experiment continued. In the last entry, the warden wrote, "Interference contained, measures applied." "Continue regimen." He snapped the notebook closed, bent his hand around the brass pocket watch, and walked down the gallery steps. The head guard met him with the junior guard in tow, face raw and eyes lowered. The warden looked at Samuel and then at the men on the platform. See that the sequence is maintained. No compassion that disturbs counting. Samuel's shoulders shook. He did not look at the warden. The head guard turned Samuel toward the center and pushed him back into the line for the next rotation. The platform resumed its slow arc and then accelerated to the new tempo. The men moved. Records were made. The experiment gained another cycle. The final concrete beat arrived when the warden replaced the watch on its chain and tapped the cover closed, a precise sound that sealed the night's tally. The platform stuck in the small hours and the landing spat a man across the boards. Prisoner 12 struck the rail with his shoulder and slid, blanket tearing. A guard shoved him back by the collar while another shouted, "Move him, Marek!" Keep it turning. Suspicion tightened prisoner 27's jaw in that instant. The same suspicion that had kept him awake since the guard had wrenched him from his bunk weeks earlier. He fought the impulse to run toward the pit and instead leaned against the cold slat until his breath slowed. Prisoner 27 watched the jam with a mind that catalogued motion the way the warden catalogued collapse. Degrees of tilt, the grind in the axle, the way a boot caught a nail. He had seen the guard wrench him before and had tasted the same precise panic then. That memory sat like grit under his tongue. The cold opening named the problem clearly. This rotation was not merely punishment, it was a designed variable. Prisoner 27's choice that night was shaped by that suspicion. To follow, to look, to learn the schedule, or to die not knowing why. They hauled prisoner 12 to his feet. Marek, the head guard, barked orders with a voice like a leather strap, "Get him upright. Watch the watch." Janek, hold the light. Jank held the sputtering candle and looked at the axle where the boards met the pit. His fingers trembled. The prisoners shifted in the gallery as one body recognizes a change in pattern. Some pressed faces to rails, others pressed hands to wounds. Prison 27 moved along the slats, every step a small calculation. He kept his head low and let the hinges of the platform tell him what happened. The warden arrived alone, coat taut, brass watch tucked to his chest. He climbed the inspection railing with slow, measured steps and crouched over prisoner 12 without touching him. He read the man's face as if he expected the face to explain itself. Vitals, the warden, he wrote in his notebook with oil-clothed fingers. He did not ask for names. He did not raise his voice. His presence collapsed argument into data. Prisoner 27 let anger rise like a pressure at the base of his skull and then clipped it with a decision. Find the schedule. He moved down through the dim corridor where bunks tilted and the chain slung from a peg. Leader had promised a note. She was a small woman who moved between men like a shadow with hands that could pick a lock or fold a message. Prisoner 7 slid her the altered turntable in the faint thatched light. "They'll speed it tonight," Leader whispered. Jank heard Marek arguing. Leader's voice was quick. She did not allow trimmer. An urgency bled into the group. Prisoner 27 heard it in the scrape of a boot, the quick rustle of paper. He touched the note with the tip of his finger and felt the ridge where someone had scratched times into the margin. The schedule's numbers had been changed. Minutes were circled, then crossed, then increased. The plan had been in writing. That concrete list made suspicion shift into a new shape. Betrayal. They were not suffering randomly. They were subjects in an experiment. They moved to the supply cellar before dawn. The lock had been stripped by a file Leader kept wrapped around her forearm. Prisoner 27 and Leader worked with the efficiency of people who had practiced theft as survival. The chest opened with a small dry sound. Inside, bound ledgers sat stacked like small yellowing ribs. Prisoner 27 pulled a volume out and flipped past the ration tallies to the rotation logs. The ledger held columns of times and annotations. Heart rates, collapse windows, incremental increases noted with the warden's penciled shortened. A name, a watch, a 2-line note, tester 30 seconds. Observe failure threshold, the handwriting matched the warden's careful curl. At dawn, Jank met them by the gallery under the warden's stare. He had the look of a man who had already decided on a danger he would not deny. "We can make him slow it." Jank, we show Marek the ledger. We forced the change. Prisoner 27 touched the ledger's spine and felt the weight of proof. He looked at Jank and then at Lida. They chose to confront. The words were small at first. Marek, Janik, holding the ledger out like a desperate confession. Look. The schedule. Marek took the book with one hand and flipped pages without interest. This is Warden's work. Marek, you want to accuse the Warden. You would like to die slow and loud. Janik's mouth went thin. No, Marek, we will force the slow. We will show him you are part of it if you refuse. Marek's laugh was a broken hinge. You tell the Warden. Janik. You tell the Warden and he will find a way to make you useful again. Or gone. The exchange snapped like a twig. In 3 lines the bargain pivoted into betrayal. Marek's choice was immediate and brutal. He turned Janik's attempt into a corner and handed the ledger back to the Warden with a slow, careful smile the Warden had cultivated for evidence. They brought proof, sir. Marek, they wanted to bargain. The Warden took the ledger as if he expected it and placed it under his arm with a single finger marking a line. He raised his pen and made a note. Demonstration warranted. The Warden's voice never rose. Control fails when interfered with. We will demonstrate consequences. That phrase converted suspicion into fear among the prisoners. Prisoner 27 felt it in his limbs. The blood that cooled, the way his throat closed. The Warden ordered a demonstration. He had Marek gather the men under the gallery, and he chose the morning when the light first came through the pit. The prisoners were marched in a line to the rotation mechanism and told to bring their shoulders to the boards. We test the system's integrity. The Warden. We observe what happens when rules are broken. Prisoner 27's hands were numb as they gripped the platform edge. He felt the watch in the Warden's vest like a mockery. The brass gleamed once with a promise of measured time. Prisoner 12, still bruised from the earlier spill, was forced onto the platform. Prisoner 7 slid behind the mechanism and wedged a short bar between the gears. The plan was a desperate one. Jam the axle, stop the rotation, make the experiment impossible. Lida gave Prisoner 27 a look that was not fear but a cold, measured permission. She mouthed, "Now," and he lunged to shove the bar deeper. The gears held for a breath and then gave with a groan. Men committed their weight to the jam. Guards closed in with iron rods. Marek ordered the machine to be reversed to pull the jam free. "Pull it!" Marek shouted. A guard wrenched at the bar and caught a hand in a sprocket. A scream tore the air. The stair filled with the sound of bodies slamming. The Warden moved down from his gallery like an instrument calibrated to intervene when the experiment tilted. He did not stop the violence. He directed it. Prisoner 27 felt anger convulse through him, and then a sharper shift clarity. The ledger had made the cruelty intentional. The jam made the cruelty visible. He tore at a strap and hit a guard across the jaw. Prisoner 27. The guard said by name as if surprise were a thing to be named. That naming changed things. Authority always spoke names. Prisoner 27 answered with a shove and a short breath. Around the men tripped and fell into the pit, arms and legs tangling. Marek moved with practiced brutality, his boots crushing hands that tried to hold the bar back. Back! Marek drove a knee into a rib, and the man beneath exhaled in a wet cough. The sound changed the room into an account. The Warden stepped close and watched the ledger where it had fallen open in the dust. He pointed his pen at a line and read aloud in that thin, neutral voice. Observe. Failure threshold reached. Reaction. Containment applied. He did not look angry. He made notes. He instructed Marek to select a man for a decisive example. Select one who will not recover quickly. The Warden, make the halt teach them the cost. Marek scanned faces and settled on Prisoner 12. A prisoner pushed between guards and shouted, "No!" Voices rose and fell in a ragged tide. Prisoner 27 grabbed the nearest guard's wrist and twisted. The guard cursed. Lida moved like a small animal through the crush, and Janik shouted a single word, "Stop." The Warden ignored the pleas and lifted a lantern as if staging a demonstration in a classroom. The Warden's watch clicked. He timed the halt. He measured the crowd's intake of breath. Prisoner 12 stood with his shirt gone to the waist, where a guard had ripped it earlier. Marek bound his wrists to the post at the mechanism and the machine began to turn again, slowly at first, then with a cruel momentum. The platform shifted and Prisoner 12's feet met a moving board. The Warden's hand hovered over his notebook. "Record the failure point," he said. The men around the pit shouted. Some tried to cut the straps with teeth or a hidden blade. The chain scraped across wood with a sound like fingernails. At the moment the mechanism forced a violent toss, a single prisoner surged and wedged himself under the platform's lip. The body took the brunt, catching prisoner 12's fall with a final, wrenching sound. The room stilled because a life had become the instrument of stoppage. Prisoner 27 saw the face of the man who had jammed himself beneath them. He was young, his eyes rolling back, a thin line of blood at his temple. Leader's fingers closed around the ledger and the paper trembled. Janek reached down and pressed both hands to the young man's shoulder until they felt the last weak pulse breathe. Jank. The word was too small for what they had done. The warden wrote another note. He wrote more lines about thresholds and containment, and the name of the volunteer who stopped the mechanism. He wrote it as if the man had been a test subject. Marek's face went pale for a voice, split second and then hardened again. He marched the injured into a makeshift infirmary corner and shouted for the tolly, count the losses. Prepare the ledger for inspection. Secure the writer. The warden's instructions moved through the men with a bureaucratic force. The ledger shifted from evidence to artifact under boot heels. In the scramble, Janek slid the ledger from the table and into his coat. His fingers were steady, but his breaths came like a man who had run. Jank. Leader hissed, "Where are you going?" "Out." "Jank, I will hide this. I will carry it far enough that someone sees." Prisoner 27 watched Janek's back while Marek barked orders that sounded like terms of imprisonment. Relocations, reprisals, reassignments. The warden closed his notebook and walked back to the gallery as though the day's exercises had concluded. He touched his signet ring and watched his people move with the neatness of a well-oiled machine. There was no triumphant cheer. There was not even a quiet victory. The camp settled into a different kind of noise. The low, taut moans of the injured, the counting of losses, the careful rattling of shackles. Leader crouched by the man who had wedged himself. She tore cloth to bind a wound and then rose. "We bought a delay," she said to prisoner 27. Her mouth was dry. That's all. They had jammed the mechanism and made a man pay. The ledger had been moved. Jank had vanished into a shadow path beyond the wall. The warden had not been dethroned. They found shelter in a small passage past the infirmary where dust stayed like a thin skin over the stones. Prisoner 27 peeled the ledger open and looked at the warden's annotations. There were comments not only on time but on human response. A note on vocalization, a line about sleep deprivation's effect on memory. The entries read like clinical entries in a laboratory book. Prisoner 27 pointed at one line. "He wrote how men sing when they are near collapse," he said. "He wrote how they stop seeing one another as men." Leader looked at him and closed her fingers around the corner of the page, as if she could stop the ink from being true. Jank returned 3 hours later with his coat rimmed in mud and his hair smeared with soot. He carried no ledger. He passed Leader the ledger's twin volume wrapped in oilcloth and nodded once. "I buried theirs in the ditch outside the south wall," he said. "The ledger I carry has copies, margins, a list of who has been noted as useful. We have something to trade now." Janek's voice held a tired sharpness that had angles. Prisoner 27 read the second ledger and found entries that connected faces to experiments. The warden had been collecting names. They planned with a focus that felt like a new limb. They would not kill the warden. Killing would only make the warden a martyr inside the system. They would send the ledger beyond the wall, to a place where a voice could carry truth to men with power to act differently. Leader would slip through a passage at mid-morning and take the ledger. Jank would make false reports to Marek about movements and rations. Prisoner 27 would create a diversion that drew attention to the infirmary while they moved men quietly into the hidden passages. Each decision shifted their fear into a brittle resolve. Before they left, they returned to the rotation pit to gather evidence. A twisted sprocket, a scrap of leather from the strap Marek had used, a smudge of the warden's peculiar ink on a wooden beam. Prisoner 27 ran his fingers over the ink and felt its roughness like an accusation. He took the scrap of strap and put it in his pocket. It was a small, concrete item he could show. Leader stuffed the ledger into the hollow of her coat and folded herself into the dark like a seam closing. They moved at first light. Prisoner 27 held a man's elbow and guided him to the passage where the wall had been loosened by rain and careful feet. A guard walked past within earshot and did not look twice. Marek had sworn the removal of men would be done formally. Janek stepped out into the corridor with a false limp and drew Marek's attention. "Marek, we have a man pretending to be hurt." Janek shouted with the perfect cadence of someone who had rehearsed lying. Marek turned and cursed. His head snapped back toward the infirmary like a bell. The diversion worked as intended. Lida moved like a shadow, ledger under her coat, and slipped through the south gap. She carried the book like a child, careful and absolute. She did not look back. Prisoner 27 watched until she was nothing but a shape in the thin light, and then felt emptier than he expected. Janek returned with news that he had left a forged note in the warden's stare that spoke of a transfer of men that would occupy Marek for a day. "It should slow the checks, Janek. It gives Lida time." His voice had a pause that sounded like a man who had seen a life he could not take back. The camp altered its rhythms. The warden resumed his notebook, his pen moving across a page that now had missing lines. He did not stop writing. He recorded the demonstration and the volunteers and made new entries about containment. Marek paced the galleries with a flat face and unblinking eyes. Janek was reassigned to a distant watch. Prisoners were shuffled into new bunks as Marek threatened tighter rotations. Nothing broke cleanly. News traveled slow and then faster. A farmer beyond the wall noticed a woman with a ledger-shaped bulge in her coat. He heard a conversation in the market about a strange bundle moved at night. A letter was passed among men with relatives beyond the camp who kept small connections to the outside. The ledger reached a pair of hands that had the means to read and the willingness to act. Those hands copied pages, sent them farther. People with power who had once looked away now found the ledger in their lap and read in paragraphs the warden's lines and Marek's names and the list of times when sleep was measured as a weapon. There was no parade of justice. There was a single quiet knock on the warden's door weeks later. A man stood there with a paper and a hard face. He read aloud a brief demand for explanation. The warden took the paper without rising and placed his pen down. He folded his hands and said, "I have records. I have reasons." He did not beg. The official moved on the ledger's evidence and began questions. Marek was taken aside and given orders to answer. The warden's authority wavered as papers changed who had to explain to whom. The camp's hierarchy shifted like a table being moved. It did not fall, but the shim under one leg was removed. In the infirmary corner, the man who had jammed himself beneath the mechanism recovered enough to talk. His name was Tomasz, and he had been a farmer before they took him. He prisoner 27 with short sentences that he had thought only of stopping the machine. "I did not think I would be paid with silence, Tomasz. I only thought of the boys who slept in the next bunk." Prisoner 27 nodded and put his hand on Tomasz's shoulder. Their silence was a shared contract. They had saved a moment. They had purchased a chance. The warden was not immediately removed. He kept his coat and his watch for a time and continued to write. His notebooks were confiscated and copied and compared and then leaked in parts. People read the entries and reacted in ways the warden had not measured. Letters, complaints, an investigation that crept into the camp like ivy. Marek was disciplined but kept a rank in name. Janek was released from the distant watch and, for a time, given tasks that kept him from the more dangerous work. Lida left at dusk with a new cloak and no ledger. She had passed it to a man with a carriage beyond the east road and returned with a look that would not settle. Prisoner 27 stood at the rail the night the warden resumed his notebook and watched the man write with the same steady hand. He felt a final shift in himself. From raw suspicion to a quieter judgment, he could not forgive what had been done, and he did not expect the ledger to erase the bruises. But the ledger had changed where responsibility sat. The camp's daily rotations continued, but officials visited more often. The warden no longer wrote in private what he could not explain in public. In the last pages of the ledger, there was a final line the warden had scribbled and meant to keep unread. Outcome uncertain. Variables uncontrolled. Prisoner 27 read it and did not tremble. He folded the scrap of strap from his pocket and set it beside the ledger's duplicate he had kept hidden. Nothing. He looked at Tomasz and then at Lida when she returned for a single night to pass along a name and a place where papers had been left for safekeeping. The story did not end with banners or confessions. The warden remained a man who could order men and write on paper. Marek remained Marek, but the ledger traveled. It brought questions and the occasional visit from strangers with authority. It loosened the certainty of silence. The camp rearranged its math of fear into a different calculus where exposure could be counted as risk. Prisoner 27 kept his watch over small things. The strap in his pocket, the shut-down marks on the beam, the list of names written in the margins of a book he no longer carried. They closed the chapter with one concrete action. Leader slipped through a shadowed passage beyond the camp wall at sunrise and passed the ledger to a man with a cart. He folded it into his coat and walked toward the main road with a face that said nothing. Prisoner 27 watched the cart until it was a dark smudge and then turned away to the work of counting bunk slats and the slow measures of survival. The last line of the day was not a speech. It was a movement. Leader had left the ledger in the world and the warden had his notebook returned to him. The warden opened his pen and wrote a note about containment. Outside, the cart moved faster into the dawn with a book that would make men in distant offices read what had been done. The chapter closed on an action that kept the story moving. A ledger on a cart, Leader's small figure melting into a lane, and Janek's promise that the ledger would reach hands that could do more than write. The warden resumed his watch, but the ledger's pages had changed the shape of what could be hidden. The men wore their exhaustion like a map now, and the certainty of silence had been scored with a fresh line. The camp continued to turn, but a new variable had been introduced into the rotation: exposure. The ledger had become the instrument of that change, and Leader's steps carried it beyond the wall into a morning that would remember what happened inside the rotation chamber.